Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to drift into a world far removed from ours. A world of stone keeps and fog-draped moors, of iron and silence, of cold dawns and flickering candlelight. This is the story of a medieval knight, not of glory and shining armor, but of the quiet brutality that defined his days and the whispered pain that haunted his nights. Through 22 gently unfolding parts, we will walk beside him from the innocence of his first-page duties to the weight of bloodied battles and aching regrets. You may find your heart stirred and your mind lulled as we go, one soft breath at a time. So now, lay back, let your eyes grow heavy, and listen. His name was Aldrich of Winthorne, born not of noble blood, but of soil and sweat. The year was 1274, and the wind that swept across the fenlands carried the scent of peat fires and damp hay. His father, Garin, was a stablemaster under Lord Berengar, and his mother, Malis, baked barley loaves for the manor kitchen. Theirs was a modest life, hemmed in by routine, soot, and duty. From his earliest memory, Aldrich's world was edged in wood and stone. The crumbling tower of Winthorne Keep stood like a weathered guardian over the village, its banners often tattered, its garrison lean. There were no shining tournaments here, no grand feasts, only the daily grind of service to a minor lord whose lands were more swamp than sown field. At 7 years old, Aldrich was chosen to serve as a page. It was a small honor, but in the eyes of his mother, it was a gleaming chance, a narrow stair toward knighthood. She sewed his tunic with trembling hands, stitched a hawk into the hem with wool thread she had saved for winters. Aldrich remembered her weeping softly that night, her arms thin and cold around him, her breath heavy with fatigue. His duties began before dawn. He swept the flagstone floors of the great hall, cleaned the rushes, and fetched firewood with numb fingers. He learned to lace his master's boots with quiet precision, to bear the weight of chainmail without complaint. His knight, Sir Renfred, was not cruel, but neither was he kind. There was little room for sentiment among men who had survived 3 northern campaigns. "You are not a child anymore," Sir Renfred had said the morning after Aldrich's 8th birthday, his voice rough with sleep and drink. "You belong to the sword now. Learn it, or it will unmake you." And so, Aldrich learned. He learned to polish steel until his knuckles split, to carry messages between distant manors through sleet and hunger. He learned to keep his back straight when reprimanded, to bow low to the steward even when his legs ached. Each task earned him no praise, only the absence of rebuke, which became its own strange reward. He watched the knights train in the yard, their wooden swords thudding against each other with the rhythm of thunder. They moved like dancers in iron skins, sweat gleaming on their brows. He admired them from a distance, never daring to dream he would one day stand among them. But his dreams, when they came, were not of glory. They were of silence, of drifting down the riverbank at dusk when the world seemed to hush itself to listen. He loved the water's lull, the reeds that bent like whispers. At times he wondered what lay beyond the marshes, past the horizon where sky and land kissed in mist. One winter, when the snow fell heavy and the pigs lay quiet in the sty, Aldrich was made to accompany Sir Renfred to the borders of Winthorne. A neighboring baron had encroached upon the land, and a show of arms was needed. It was Aldrich's first glimpse of true power, not the stern discipline of the keep, but the raw tension of men who might kill one another before nightfall. The camp was cold. Horses whinnied nervously in the dark. Fires flickered like breath against the void. Aldrich sat on a log, his hands wrapped around a steaming bowl of thin pottage. He heard men speak of sieges, of broken oaths, of flesh torn by axe and flame. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he watched the stars and thought of his mother's hands, of the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The standoff ended with no bloodshed. A treaty was signed. But something had changed in Aldrich. He returned to Winthorne with quieter steps and eyes that watched more than they wandered. He no longer flinched when Sir Renfred shouted. He no longer cried when he bled. At 10, he began his combat training. Wooden swords at first, then blunted steel. His arms ached from the strain, his palms blistered. He learned to strike without fear, to parry without hesitation. The older squires mocked him for his size, but he did not answer. He let his silence speak. And in time, they stopped. In the quiet corners of the keep, he practiced alone. He mimicked the movements of the knights he watched, studied the flow of their stances, the rhythm of their footwork. He had no teacher beyond repetition, no mentor beyond pain. But he improved, slowly and steadily. Sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, he would lie awake and imagine himself far away, in a sunlit glade with no banners, no oaths, just wind and earth and peace. Yet each morning, he rose and donned his tunic, and stepped once more into the cold discipline of duty. For in Aldrich's world, softness was a thing one had to hide, lest it be taken. And already, though he was only a child, he knew that the path to knighthood was carved not in valor, but in quiet suffering. The days in Winthorn passed not in splendor, but in patterns, measured, demanding, and silent. As Aldrich crossed into his 12th year, the cold stone of the keep had become familiar to him, each crevice and echo absorbed like breath. He knew the scent of the rushes after a rain, the faint salt of sweat on the training fields, the shiver of iron against leather. There was comfort in the repetition, in the certainty that the sun would rise behind the eastern tower, and that the bell would toll before the bread ovens were stoked. Sir Renfred remained distant. He was a man who spoke with clipped phrases and seldom looked anyone in the eye. But he watched. Aldrich noticed this more with time. The way Renfred's gaze lingered on his footwork during sparring drills, the nod he gave, almost imperceptibly, when Aldrich replaced the dented armor in the exact correct order on the rack. It was a language of quiet acknowledgement, and Aldrich came to crave it more than praise. His body began to change. No longer was he the skinny child who'd stumbled under a pail of water. His limbs thickened with muscle, his stance grew firmer. The old squires no longer called him mudwhelp under their breath. Some even asked him for help in sharpening blades or mending straps, not out of kindness, but from a shared understanding that Aldrich did things well, always with precision, always with care. Yet life did not soften. One autumn, when the first frost kissed the fields and the blackbirds fled south, a fever swept through the village. It took the youngest and the oldest first. By the time the mist lifted, 7 of the peasant children and 4 elders were buried beneath the hill. Aldrich's mother, Malis, fell ill too. He was not permitted to visit Tad for fear of spreading the illness to the keep. He waited instead by the edge of the wall, every dusk, until a stable boy passed him word that she was still breathing. She survived, but her hands never recovered their strength. The bread she once made for the manor came less frequently, and Aldrich saw her shoulders stoop lower each time she passed through the courtyard. He wanted to speak to her, to say something of the ache that had settled in his chest like a stone, but he was a page now, and pages were watched, judged, weighed. Emotions were a luxury only the idle could afford. That winter was harsh. Ice clung to the shutters and water turned to glass in the basins. Every morning, Aldrich's fingers trembled as he laced Sir Renfred's boots, yet he never let his teeth chatter aloud. He cleaned the knight's armor until he could see his breathless reflection in the breastplate, a boy with hollow cheeks and fire behind the eyes. Then came the snow hunt. It was a tradition, old and stained with blood. Each year, when the first deep snow covered the lowlands, the Knights of Winthorn rode out in pairs, hunting not for food, but for the test of endurance and skill. Each knight took a squire or page, and they were expected to bring back game or, failing that, proof of their journey, broken antlers, a skinned fox, a hawk's talon. It was a brutal rite, symbolic more than necessary. Few questioned it. No one refused it. Sir Renfred took Aldrich. They rode out at dawn, hoarfrost clinging to the mane of the gelding. The air was sharp, the sky a dull pewter. They passed the frost-covered marshes, where the reeds stood brittle and the ponds cracked under hoof. For hours they rode in silence, broken only by the distant cry of crows and the occasional wheeze of the horse's breath. Renfred was a skilled tracker, and Aldrich followed closely, observing every pause, every glance. When they spotted a stag's trail, deep hoofprints pressed into the snow, Renfred signaled with a hand, and Aldrich dismounted without being told. They moved quietly then, like shadows. It took nearly 2 hours before they found it. A young stag, its antlers not yet full, drinking from a stream half covered in ice. Aldrich felt a twist in his gut, not for the kill, but for the stillness of the creature. It seemed part of the land, a vision of grace. Yet Renfred drew his bow. The arrow struck cleanly. The stag did not cry out. It simply collapsed into the snow, its breath rising one last time in a puff of steam. Aldrich was made to help drag it, his fingers numb, his shoulders burning. By the time they returned to the keep, night had fallen and the air was thick with smoke from the hearths. Renfred said nothing as he handed the stag over to the butcher. But as they walked past the stables, he paused. "You kept pace," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not all do." It was the closest thing to a compliment Aldrich had ever heard from him. In the weeks that followed, Aldrich felt a shift. He was given more responsibility, allowed to accompany Renfred to council gatherings, even permitted to observe the armory counts. He said little, but he absorbed everything. The names of the merchants, the sigils of visiting knights, the way alliances were forged over wine and wary eyes. One evening, as the fire crackled in the great hall and shadows danced along the beams above, Sir Renfred summoned Aldrich to his side. His face was drawn, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. "You've done well," he said, voice graveled. "Next spring, I will name you squire. It is not a promise made lightly." Aldrich said nothing, but he bowed so deeply that his hair brushed the stone floor. That night, alone in the cold dormitory, he allowed himself a rare moment. He reached under his cot and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a piece of wool stitched long ago by his mother, the hawk still visible though faded by time. He pressed it to his chest, and for the first time in many months, he slept not as a boy burdened, but as one briefly weightless in the tide of a dream. Spring arrived not with trumpets or song, but with the slow retreat of frost and the swelling of the river banks. The snow melted into the soil, turning the paths to muck and the lower fields into puddled mirrors. Aldrich awoke each day to the scent of damp earth and the faint promise of green. It was a quiet renewal, humble in its unfolding like most things in Winthorne. He was 15 now, tall for his age, though still lean, with muscles forged by repetition rather than bulk. His hair had darkened over the years, and his face, once round with youth, had sharpened at the jaw and cheek. There was no ceremony to mark his rise to squire, no feast, no garlanded maidens, only a short nod from Sir Renfred and a belt newly fitted with a dagger. "You'll ride beside me now," Renfred had said one morning, without looking up from his maps. "See to the saddle yourself, and keep the blade sharp. Dull steel is a death sentence." And so began the next phase of Aldrich's training, not merely physical, but mental, political, and spiritual. A squire was more than a servant. He was an apprentice in the rites of war and the subtleties of noble life. He listened during court sessions where land disputes were settled and punishments meted out. He memorized the bloodlines of neighboring lords, the trade routes that fed Winthorne, the way to spot a liar by the twitch of a brow. But most of all, he rode. Sir Renfred believed in movement. "The sword is useless if the body tires," he said. Every morning, Aldrich saddled his palfrey and followed Renfred across the hills, through woods still wet from thaw, across streams that bit at their boots, into fields where the wind sang low in the grass. They trained with lance and sword, shield and bow, from sunup to dusk, until the sky bled pink and the ravens circled home. There was no praise, only progression. Renfred's lessons were hard, but never cruel. He expected much, gave little, and demanded silence in failure. Aldrich learned to measure success not by reward, but by the shrinking of correction, the absence of that small frown in his knight's eyes. At night, his body throbbed with exhaustion, but his mind wandered. He would lie beneath the rafters, listening to the shifting of the other squires, and think of what lay beyond Winthorne. Tales of distant castles, of sieges and crusades, of Saracen blades and dragons hidden in the east. Though he would never admit it, part of him longed for the chance to see such things. Not for glory, but for proof that there was more than this cycle of duty and dusk. Yet within the keep, stories of war were whispered with caution. Lord Berengar, aging and wrapped in wool despite the warming days, spoke often of border unrest. A minor skirmish to the west had left several knights dead. Word had reached Winthorne of rising tensions, barons breaking their oaths, church tithes growing heavier, whispers of tax revolts in the southern manors. One evening, Renfred returned from council with an edge to his silence. He paced in his chambers, sharpening his sword with deliberate strokes. Aldrich sat nearby, sorting bolts and arrowheads, pretending not to watch. "The world's cracking," Renfred muttered once, more to the hearth than to Aldrich. "You'll see it soon enough," You'll learn what steel is really for. It was not long after that Winthorne was summoned to arms. A banner arrived on a courier's back, a black wolf on red silk, the sigil of Lord Varon of Elmwatch, a call to rally, to send men and swords in aid of a contested border claim. Berengar, despite his waning strength, could not refuse. Fealty demanded it. Aldrich stood in the yard as the levy was drawn. 30 men from the village, some barely older than him, others bent with age but still strong with scythe and axe, gathered with fearful eyes. The knights prepared with calm grimness, checking their mail, their stirrups, the seals on their crests. War had come, not with a roar, but with a scroll and a seal. Renfred called for Aldrich at dawn. "We ride with the first light," he said, donning his breastplate. "You will stay by me. Watch, listen, say little. This is no tourney field. Blood here has no banners." The ride to Elmwatch took 3 days. They moved in columns, knights, squires, footmen, and a cart of provisions. The mood was heavy, conversation sparse. Aldrich saw how even the seasoned warriors tightened their grips on reins, how laughter came only in brittle echoes. Along the road, peasants knelt or crossed themselves as they passed, eyes wide with the dread that only armored men could bring. Elmwatch was a gray fortress, larger than Winthorne but colder, less lived in. Its Lord Varon welcomed them with polite detachment. He was a hawk-nosed man with pale lips and sharp eyes. He nodded to Renfred, barely acknowledging Aldrich. The cause of conflict was a strip of woodland claimed by both Elmwatch and a rival, Lord Corwin. Disputes over timber and hunting rights had escalated. Now war was declared, not with grandeur, but necessity. 2 nights after their arrival, Aldrich stood atop the battlements and looked down at the torches burning below. He could see the flicker of enemy watchfires across the hills. The air was still, and the moon hung heavy. He felt the weight of something ancient then, older than feuds or flags, the pull of violence that slumbered beneath the earth, waiting only for men to wake it. When the skirmish began, it was sudden. At dawn, horns blared and the world erupted. Aldrich rode with Renfred at the flank, sword in hand, heart hammering like a drumbeat in his throat. The field was not wide, just a clearing between woods, now churned into mud by hooves and feet. Steel clashed. Screams rose like birds into the sky. Aldrich moved as he had been trained, watching Renfred's back, parrying where he could, staying upright. He did not remember his first kill. Only the weight of the man as he fell against him, the way the blood soaked his sleeve, warm and sudden. The face was blank, eyes open, mouth slack, a smear of youth not much older than his own. Aldrich had not meant to strike that hard, had not even thought, just reacted. The battle ended before noon. A dozen men lay dead, more wounded. Elmwatch held the field, but the price was real. Aldrich sat by the fire that night, silent. His hands were clean, but he still felt the stickiness beneath his fingernails. Renfred did not speak of the day. He simply handed Aldrich a cup of broth and sat beside him, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. "You fought well," he said, after a long silence. "You did what was needed." Aldrich nodded, but said nothing. He could not tell if what he felt was pride or sickness. The stars above were bright, uncaring, and in the distance wolves howled, drawn not by the living, but by the scent of the fallen, carried on the breeze. They returned to Winthorne beneath gray skies, their columns smaller and quieter than when it had departed. The air was thick with the scent of spring mud, and the hooves of their horses left deep grooves in the road that would take weeks to vanish. No songs were sung, no flags fluttered. There was no triumph in their gait, only weariness, only the kind of silence that comes after too much shouting. Aldrich rode with his head down, his cloak damp and heavy upon his shoulders. The faces of the fallen lingered behind his eyes. He had not spoken since the battle, not truly. His mouth open for necessities. "Yes, sir, and as you wish, but little more." Each word felt like a stone pulled from a river, too cold, too heavy to hold. The keep welcomed them in its usual manner. No fanfare, just the lowering of the drawbridge and the shuffling of boots across the bailey. Lord Berengar met them in the great hall, his figure thin beneath his robes, eyes shrewd despite the lines of age etched deep into his face. "Well done, Renfred," he said, offering his hand with the slow dignity of the old. "You've served me honorably, as ever." Sir Renfred bowed and spoke in tones dry and precise, giving only the needed account. He made no mention of Aldrich's presence or part in the fight. That, it seemed, was not for lords to hear. Aldrich returned to his quarters and for the first time in many weeks washed himself in warm water. The blood had long dried and flaked away during the journey, but still he scrubbed until his skin was red and raw. The warmth could not chase away the memory. He slept poorly that night. Dreams came in strange shapes, of trees that bled, of eyes in the fog, of distant cries. He awoke before dawn and wandered the courtyard, breathing the chill air and watching mist roll over the ramparts. It was a kind of peace, if one did not look too closely. In the days that followed, Aldrich returned to his duties. He sharpened blades, cleaned armor, saw to Renfred's horse with careful hands. Yet something had shifted in him, subtly but surely. Where once he had listened to the idle boasting of other squires with a quiet hunger, now he found their tales hollow. They spoke of glorious duels, of slaying beasts in foreign woods, of kisses stolen from noble girls. Aldrich said nothing, only nodded or smiled faintly when prompted. He spent more time alone now, often in the chapel or by the old well behind the smithy, where moss clung to the stones like faded memory. He read when he could, old texts in Latin, sermons, chronicles of saints and martyrs. He did not seek wisdom in them, only distance. One afternoon, as spring reached its height and the hawthorn trees began to bloom in white, Aldrich was summoned to the training yard. Sir Renfred stood there with his arms folded, watching two squires spar under the eye of the weapons master. He gestured for Aldrich to approach. "You've carried steel into real battle," Renfred said, without preamble. "You've spilled blood. That makes you a man in the eyes of war, if not yet in name." Aldrich said nothing, his gaze steady. "I will take you to Kaelhold," Renfred continued, "in 3 weeks' time. A gathering of knights is to be held. There will be trials, tests. If you show well, I will put forth your name for elevation." Aldrich's heart tightened. Knighthood. The word had once burned within him, a beacon in the dark. Now it felt heavier, slower, less flame, more stone. "As you will, sir." Renfred studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Good, we'll train for it, as we always have." The weeks passed swiftly. Each day brought new drills. Mounted combat, shield formations, the art of the lance. Renfred drove him harder than ever before, though never cruelly. He corrected with sharp eyes and precise strikes, pushing Aldrich to the edge of fatigue. In the quiet hours after training, Aldrich would sit beneath the sycamore tree by the old wall, binding his knuckles and breathing through the ache. He felt himself growing stronger, more precise, but also more distant from the boy who once dreamed beside that very tree. That boy had known fear. This one had learned to bury it. Finally, the morning came. They set out at dawn, and Renfred and Aldrich, along with a small retinue from Winthorn. The road to Kaelhold was long and winding, cutting through thick forests and gentle hills. They passed other bands of knights along the way, their banners high, their retinues bright with new armor and pride. Some nodded in greeting, others merely stared. Kaelhold itself rose like a relic from legend. Towering battlements, banners in every hue, and the hum of 100 voices filled the air. The tournament was not of the grandest sort. This was no royal affair, but it was still a spectacle. Pavilions dotted the field like petals upon grass, and the scent of roasted meats and trampled flowers mingled on the wind. Aldrich was given a place among the squires of Winthorn, though he rode with Renfred in the parade of arms. He bore no personal crest, only the sigil of his lord, a gray boar upon deep blue. Yet even so his posture drew notice. Whispers followed him, that one rode at Elmwatch, some said, Renfred's shadow. The trials began the next day. The tests were rigorous, mounted tilts, sword duels, judgment of horsemanship and command. Aldrich passed each with calm efficiency. He did not dazzle, but he did not falter. Renfred watched from the edge, his arms folded, saying little. In the final test, Aldrich faced a squire from Dunsrick, a boy clad in gleaming mail, bold and quick. Their duel was fierce. Blades rang against shield and helm. Aldrich took a blow to the shoulder that numbed his arm, but he did not yield. He stepped forward, drove the flat of his blade into the Dunsrick boy's chest, and brought him to the ground. Silence followed. Then, slowly, applause. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Kaelhold's towers, Sir Renfred approached Aldrich. His expression, as always, was unreadable. "You've done enough," he said. "Tomorrow, we speak to the heralds." Aldrich looked past him to the field, now quiet and golden in the twilight. Children chased each other between tents, and the low murmur of lutes carried on the breeze. He nodded once, but in his heart there was no thunder of triumph, only a stillness. The stillness of a man who had walked so far that the destination no longer mattered, only the weight of each step and the silence that followed after. Morning came gently to Kalehold. The mists lingered longer than usual, curling around the tents and banners like the last sighs of sleep. Dew clung to every surface, armor, grass, even the silken corners of the Lord's pavilions. Aldrich rose early, before the bells called for mass, and stood at the edge of the encampment, watching the sunlight stretch over the hills. He felt no thrill, no sense of elevation, only a quiet readiness. This was the day he would be named. If the heralds found no blemish in his conduct, no flaw in his trial, Sir Renfred would speak the words, and the rite would be performed. Knighthood. The very word once stirred images of golden spurs, flowing banners, and tales carved into memory. But now, to Aldrich, it felt like stone, weighty, solid, inevitable. When the sun had cleared the mist and the camp began to stir, Renfred came to him. He wore his ceremonial tunic, the deep blue of Winthorn with the boar crest stitched in silver thread. He looked older in that morning light, more weary than ever before. "You are ready?" he said. "They have accepted your name. The rites will be held at midday after the final mass. You will kneel before Lord Varin, for Berengar is too frail to travel. You'll be knighted in the eyes of Elmwatch, not Winthorn, but the name still holds." Aldrich nodded. "Did you sleep?" Renfred asked, his voice quieter than usual. "I did." "Did you dream?" A pause. "No." Renfred regarded him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Come, it is time to dress." They returned to their quarters. The squires helped Aldrich into his ceremonial garb, a plain white tunic over bare skin, signifying purity of intent. A red cloak was draped over his shoulders to symbolize courage and sacrifice. He wore no armor, no sword. That would come only after the vows. He walked to the chapel with measured steps, the flagstones cold beneath his boots. The small building was built of gray stone, with ivy trailing down its outer wall and the scent of incense thick within. Candles flickered beside the altar. A priest in dark vestments murmured blessings over each candidate. There were 7 to be knighted that day. Aldrich did not speak to them. He kept his eyes low, hands folded before him, heart steady. When his turn came, he knelt upon the cushion before Lord Varin. The hall had fallen still. Even the distant birds had quieted. Lord Varin, garbed in black and crimson, held a sword above Aldrich's bowed head. His voice was clear, but not loud. "Do you swear to serve truth and justice, to guard the innocent and uphold the honor of the knighthood?" "I do." "Do you vow to protect the weak, to fight without hatred, and to stand firm in righteousness, even when alone?" "I do." "And will you, Aldrich of Winthorn, bear the burden of the sword with humility, knowing that power is a gift given not for glory, but for duty?" "I will." Varin tapped the flat of the sword to each of Aldrich's shoulders. "Then rise, Sir Aldrich. Knight of Winthorn, sworn to the code." Aldrich stood. A squire placed a blade at his side, his own sharpened and polished, the grip newly wrapped. Another draped his cloak anew, this time with the symbol of his house stitched in silver upon the back. The ceremony was complete, but Aldrich felt no transformation, no fire in his veins, only the weight of the cloth, the steel, and the eyes of those watching. That evening, a feast was held. Music rose from the pavilions, and laughter rang out across the grounds. Meat roasted on open spits, and goblets clinked with wine and honeyed ale. Young knights boasted of their trials. Older ones offered congratulations, subtle warnings, or both. Sir Renfred did not linger at the tables. He stood at the edge of the gathering, near a brazier, sipping a thin broth instead of wine. Aldrich found him there, drawn to the quiet. "I thought I might feel something more," Aldrich admitted, his voice low. Renfred smiled faintly, his breath fogging in the cooling air. "Knighthood isn't a thunderclap, Aldrich. It's a slow rain. It wears away the man you were until all that remains is duty, and if you're fortunate, a bit of yourself." Aldrich looked out across the field. A minstrel was singing beneath a tent, a love ballad too soft for war-worn hearts. The new knights danced or drank or boasted. He watched them, and for a moment he felt apart from them, as though his path had already diverged. "Will it get easier?" he asked. Renfred was silent a long while. "No," he said finally, "but you'll get quieter. And quieter men often see clearer." They returned to Winthorn a week later. Word had already reached the keep, and Lord Berengar received Aldrich with a rare smile. "My last night," he said softly, eyes glassy with age. "May you be my strongest." In the weeks that followed, Aldrich resumed his life, though now with the status and responsibilities of a knight. He trained the pages with patience, rode patrols across the borders, attended council sessions at Renfred's side. He was addressed with formality now, Sir Aldrich, and villagers bowed when he passed. But the world did not change. What did change was subtle. How others looked to him in moments of uncertainty, how his voice began to carry weight, how the younger squires glanced up at him in quiet admiration. Aldrich carried it all without expression, though inside, he marked each moment as one might carve notches into wood. One evening, as the first leaves of autumn began to fall, he rode out alone to the western moors. The sky was vast above him, streaked with dusk. He dismounted at the edge of a hill and sat in the heather, watching the wind ripple through the grass. From his saddlebag, he pulled a bundle wrapped in old cloth, the hawk emblem his mother had sewn when he was a boy. Faded now, its edges frayed, but still intact. He held it in his hand as the wind passed through him. He was a knight now. But in that moment, beneath the widening stars and the hush of twilight, he felt more like the boy who once dreamed by the well, chasing the image of honor through fog and silence. And he wondered, quietly, tenderly, what that boy would have thought of the man he had become. Autumn settled slowly upon Winthorne, painting the trees in tones of rust and gold, casting longer shadows across the fields. The air grew sharp in the mornings, crisp enough to bite the skin, and the breath of horses steamed like ghosts in the early light. Harvests were gathered, cellars filled, and candles burned longer in the great hall. Life, as it often did in the borderlands, prepared itself for the long hush of winter. Sir Aldrich rode often now, no longer as apprentice, but as sentinel. He inspected the roads between the manors, offered judgment in village disputes, and carried word from Winthorne to neighboring holdings. His presence was no longer a quiet one. He was recognized, respected, expected. The boy who once bent beneath the weight of chainmail now moved through the world as a figure of calm certainty. Yet within, a quiet dissonance stirred. He began to notice things he once overlooked. The deep lines beneath Renfred's eyes, the way Lord Berengar's hands trembled when lifting a goblet, the wariness in the laughter of the household. The world had not changed, but Aldrich saw more of its weathering. One morning, just after the first frost laid its pale breath upon the earth, a messenger arrived at Winthorne. The man was mud-caked, his horse foam-flecked and trembling. He bore the mark of Duncliffe, a manor to the south, neutral territory for most of the past decade. He spoke quickly with urgency. "Bandits," he said, "not just thieves, armed men, disciplined. They struck a trade route near the stone bridge, took wagons, livestock, 2 children. Duncliffe requests aid." Lord Berengar listened with a troubled frown. Sir Renfred, quiet at his lord's right hand, said nothing for a long while. "Then send Aldrich." And so, within the hour, Aldrich found himself riding south, 3 men at his side. Sir Callan, a grizzled veteran with more scars than teeth, and 2 younger knights, who bore arms with earnest vigor but little experience. They traveled light, cloaks drawn against the wind, eyes sharp beneath helms. As they rode, the hills grew steeper, the land rougher. Here the roads narrowed to rutted paths, the trees thickened into woods dark and watchful. By dusk, they reached the site of the attack. The damage was fresh. Wagons lay splintered in the grass, the remains of crates scattered like bones. Crows circled overhead, their cries sharp against the stillness. Aldrich dismounted and knelt beside a pool of dried blood. "No bodies," he murmured. "Only blood." Sir Callan grunted. "They took them, alive, likely to ransom." "Or worse," said one of the younger knights, his hand twitching near his sword hilt. They followed the tracks into the woods, deep footprints, signs of many riders. The trail led westward, away from Duncliffe, toward the forgotten stretch of the old forest. It was a place whispered about by peasants, a place with no proper name, only superstitions. But Aldrich did not believe in ghosts. He believed in men and the ruin they carried. They made camp at the edge of the forest, setting a low fire and sleeping in shifts. The night was cold but quiet. Aldrich lay on his back, staring at the sliver of stars between the canopy, thinking of the children taken, of their parents' grief. He felt the old weight in his chest again. Not fear, not anger, but a sorrow too quiet to name. At dawn, they rode deeper. By mid-morning, they found them. The bandits had taken shelter in the ruins of an abandoned outpost. Stone walls crumbling beneath ivy, once a watch station during the feudal wars. Now it served as their keep. From the ridge above, Aldrich counted 10 men, armed, armored, moving with purpose. Not rabble, he said. Mercenaries, perhaps. Deserters. We're 4, said Callan, and they'll know this ground better than us. Aldrich nodded slowly. Then we wait for night. Then we go in. And they did. When the moon was high and the wind masked their steps, they moved like shadows through the undergrowth. Aldrich led, blade drawn, his heart calm. He felt no thrill, only focus. The ruin's outer wall had crumbled in places. He scaled it first, dropping silently into the courtyard. The others followed. The fight, when it came, was short and brutal. Steel rang out beneath the stars. Aldrich moved with precision, his sword an extension of breath. One man lunged. Aldrich sidestepped, struck low. Another came from behind. Callan dispatched him with a growl and a crushing blow. Within minutes, it was done. The last of the bandits fled into the woods, wounded. 2 of Aldrich's knights were bloodied, but alive. They found the captives, bound in the cellar, frightened but unharmed. The children clung to Aldrich, eyes wide with trust and fear. He knelt before them and spoke gently. "You're safe now. We're taking you home." And in their eyes, something flickered, a hope not yet broken. They returned to Winthorne days later. The rescued families wept. Lord Berengar offered Aldrich quiet praise, a nod that lingered. That evening, alone in the chapel, Aldrich lit a single candle. Not for victory, but for the weight of what had not been lost. And in the flicker of the flame, he saw again that the path of the night was not one of glory, but of bearing. The burden of others, the silence of duty, the pain that must never become pride. Winter crept into Winthorne without ceremony. One morning, the ponds froze along their edges, and the stable doors groaned beneath the weight of frost. The breath of every living thing became visible, and the hearths in the great hall were stoked from dawn till dusk. Snow fell not as a flurry, but as a hush, blanketing the world in stillness and cold light. Sir Aldrich continued his duties with quiet constancy. He inspected the stores, oversaw the garrison drills, and patrolled the outlying villages, whose roofs now sagged under snow and whose people moved like bundled shadows. Each task passed without flourish, another stone laid upon the long road of duty. Lord Berengar had taken to his chambers. The old lord no longer walked the keep, but was wheeled in a carved chair when needed, wrapped in furs and fidgeting with his rings. His voice had grown thin, his judgment slower, but his eyes, gray and keen, remained watchful. When he summoned Aldrich, it was with the urgency of a man measuring time in dwindling grains. "I will not see spring," he said one evening, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "I have accepted this, but Winthorne must endure." Aldrich stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back. "You must help guide it," the Lord continued. "Renfred will not hold the line forever. He's grown quieter since the campaign. I see it in him. He won't say it aloud, but I know. He bears too much in silence." "I will serve Winthorne as long as breath is in me," Aldrich said without hesitation. Berengar gave a slow nod. "Then comes spring, when the roads thaw, ride to Falcom. Seek counsel with the Bishop of Anselm. The church is watching us. They favor those who prepare." Aldrich accepted the task. There was no glory in it, only necessity. He would ride to Falcom when winter loosened its grip, but until then, the cold months demanded his attention. Life in the keep slowed. Training was moved indoors. The chapel became a refuge not only for prayer, but for warmth. Food grew simpler, more root than meat, more barley than bread. Aldrich often walked the ramparts alone, the snow crunching beneath his boots, his breath swirling upward into the silent sky. It was during one of these evening walks that he found himself at the old armory, now seldom used. He stepped inside, lantern in hand. Dust rose in the air, catching the light like drifting ash. Rows of rusted helms and dulled blades lay untouched. It was a tomb of old wars. In the far corner, he saw something half covered beneath a moth-eaten cloth. Pulling it back, he found a shield. Renfred's first, by the look of it. The boar of Winthorne, faded and scratched, but still visible. A younger man's crest, before years and campaigns had turned him into the stoic figure Aldrich now knew. Aldrich lifted it carefully and sat down on a wooden bench. He traced the lines of the symbol with a gloved finger, and found himself wondering about the man who had once borne it. Not Sir Renfred the commander, but Renfred the new knight, the unscarred one, with dreams perhaps not so different from Aldrich's own once. In that quiet, Aldrich began to understand something deeper, that every knight wore not just mail and sword, but memory. And memory was the heaviest armor of all. Days passed, the snow deepened, word came of sickness in the eastern villages, an illness that stole breath and left fevers raging. Aldrich rode out with a healer, a pale woman with stern eyes named Sister Isolde, who spoke little but moved swiftly. Together they traveled from hamlet to hamlet, bringing poultices, prayers, and firewood. In one small hut, Aldrich knelt beside a dying man whose wife sobbed at the door. The man clutched his hand. "Are you one of them?" he whispered. "One of whom?" Aldrich asked softly. "The ones who come when it's darkest, the ones who don't run." Aldrich didn't answer. He only gripped the man's hand tighter until it went cold. They buried 12 in 3 days. The snow never stopped falling. When they returned to the keep, Aldrich went straight to the chapel. He sat in the last pew, unarmored, cloaked in silence. The candles flickered around him, casting long shadows against the stone walls. He thought of the children he had carried from the forest, of the old men dying in soot-stained huts, of the boy he used to be, the one who dreamed of dragons and banners, never knowing the quiet grief of real service. That night, Sir Renfred joined him, wordless. The two of them sat side by side as the snow piled upon the chapel roof, and time slowed. Eventually, Renfred spoke. "Do you regret it?" Aldrich shook his head. "I understand it now." Renfred exhaled slowly. Understanding is heavier than regret. They left the chapel together. Winter deepened, but Aldrich endured. He wore the silence like a cloak, bore the weight without complaint. In his stillness, he grew not colder, but more tempered. And as the winds howled and the world turned white, he became something quieter than legend, something more enduring than song. He became Winthorn's shield. The weeks that followed sank deeper into winter's embrace. Snow layered upon snow until even the trees bowed under its burden, and the streams froze in glassy silence. Each morning dawned not in gold, but in gray, and the keep became a world unto itself, sealed from the lands beyond, a breathing island of stone and firelight. Inside Winthorn, life moved in measured rhythm. Fires were tended with care, rations counted and recounted, and every errand beyond the walls became a small trial of endurance. Yet Aldrich welcomed the stillness. In the hush of winter, the noise of the world was softened, and the soul could be heard more clearly. He spent his days in solemn routine, overseeing the rationing of salt and oats, inspecting the stores of arrowheads, training the squires in the narrow hall where the cold crept through the stone walls like breath from a ghost. And each evening, when the sky darkened before the supper bell, he walked the ramparts alone, a silent sentinel with eyes on the horizon. It was during one of these twilight patrols that he noticed a figure kneeling in the snow. It was Sister Isolde, cloaked in rough wool, her hands clasped tightly, her head bowed. She was at the foot of the chapel steps, unmoving, half covered in falling flakes. Aldrich approached slowly. "Sister," he said gently, "you'll freeze." She did not look up. "Not yet." He knelt beside her, not speaking, letting the silence settle like snowfall between them. "I pray for the ones we left behind," she said eventually, "the ones we couldn't save." Aldrich nodded. "So do I." She turned her gaze toward him then, pale eyes clear and steady. "Does it haunt you?" He considered the question. "Not as ghosts," he said, "but as weight. I carry them, every face, every voice." Isolde's breath misted in the cold air. "That's what makes you worthy." They knelt together a while longer before rising and returning to the chapel. She lit a candle for each name she remembered. Aldrich stood behind her, silent. The next day brought word from the western watchtower. Riders, cloaked and armed, had been spotted near the border, unmarked, silent, too disciplined to be brigands. A scout had followed them to the edge of the Frostmere woods before losing sight. Sir Renfred called a council in the solar. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and steam rose from the cups of warmed cider passed around the room. The captains of the garrison, the steward, Aldrich, and Lord Berengar gathered close. "They ride with purpose," said Renfred. "Not to raid, not to scout. They're searching for something." Berengar nodded slowly. "And they're not ours." "No," Renfred confirmed. "Nor do they bear the banners of Elmwatch or Dunsrick. My guess? Mercenaries, hired for eyes, not blades." By whom? Asked the steward. A pause. Then Renfred looked to Aldrich. Falcom. Aldrich felt the name settle like a pebble in water. The bishop's curiosity? Berengar asked. Perhaps, said Renfred. Perhaps not. But it seems your journey, Sir Aldrich, will be of more urgency than we thought. And so preparations began. Falcom was a city of weight and whisper, a place where church and crown blurred, where abbots held lands as vast as lords and tongues wagged with coin behind cloistered doors. The Bishop of Anselm was its heart, and Aldrich's task was now twofold: to offer Winthorne's continued fealty to the church, and to understand what eyes had turned toward their borders. Before his departure, Aldrich rode out one last time into the snow-covered village beneath the keep. He passed huts with curling smoke, children bundled in wool chasing one another with laughter brittle in the cold, and elders seated beneath sheepskin cloaks, watching the world without illusion. At the chapel, he found Sister Isolde again, placing balm into the hands of a coughing child. You'll be gone before the thaw, she said without turning. Yes. She stood, wiping her hands. What do you seek in Falcom, Sir Aldrich? The truth, he answered. And what will you do if you find it? He looked past her, at the gray sky beyond the stained glass. I don't know, but I will carry it. She nodded once, then go with grace, and return with your soul intact. He rode out at dawn, alone. The road to Falcom wound through valleys choked with mist, through forests where the snow whispered under hooves, and past ruins where only wind remained to tell the stories. Aldrich traveled with provisions, arms, and silence. He spoke to no one, kept to the side paths, and moved like a man with ghosts at his back and duty ahead. By the 5th day, the city rose into view. Falcom was unlike Winthorne, a sprawl of stone and spire, layered in smoke and bells. Merchants shouted in foreign tongues, and beggars knelt beside knights in gilded surcoats. The streets were slick with slush and piety, and the air reeked of incense and ambition. Aldrich made his way to the Cathedral of St. Anselm, where the bishop's seal held sway over coin and crown alike. He was led through vaulted halls, past murals of martyrdom, and into a chamber warm with fire and heavy with the scent of parchment and wax. There, seated in a carved chair beneath a crucifix of iron and gold, was Bishop Emeric. He was a man of middle years, with eyes like still water, beautiful, unreadable, and deep enough to drown. Sir Aldrich of Winthorne, he said, his voice smooth, we've been expecting you. Of course. Here is part 9 of the story. The wind had begun to howl with a bitter chill, carrying with it the whispering breath of oncoming winter. The branches of the forest trees creaked, as though murmuring secrets to one another in the gloom. Sir Aldrich rode alone, his silhouette scarcely visible against the gray woods. His warhorse, Failwin, trod carefully over the leaf-strewn path, nostrils flaring with unease. It had been many weeks since the siege of Cairbraun, and though the city's defenses had been secured and the peasantry settled under the new command, Aldrich found no peace in the stone walls, nor among the revelries of his comrades. There was a weight within him that not even the dullest wine could lift, nor the songs of the hall dispel. He had asked leave of his lord to wander, and had been granted with a nod and a knowing glance. Knights, after all, often sought solitude when their souls needed mending. He wandered into the woodlands of Val Nerith, where the ancient oaks grew high and the canopy filtered light into pale streams. The forest had a sacred hush to it, as though it remembered a time when druids walked its roots and the old gods were still revered. Stories whispered that it was haunted, not by spirits malicious or cruel, but by memories too powerful to fade. Aldrich welcomed the silence. It was not unlike the hush of the chapel before dawn prayers, a space for reflection, for penance. That night, he made his camp beneath a leaning yew tree, its trunk gnarled like the fingers of a crone. He built no fire, for he wished not to draw attention, and the cold would be a fair companion to the thoughts that haunted him. Wrapped in his thick cloak, he lay with his back to the earth, gazing up at the tapestry of stars above. The night sky, vast and indifferent, was a reminder of his smallness, of the fleeting shadow that each man cast before the dawn. Sleep eluded him. Visions flickered behind his closed eyes. Edrin's final breath, the clatter of steel on stone, the cries of those left fatherless by his sword. He had long understood the brutality of a knight's life, but it was only now, in the stillness, that the full weight of his deeds settled upon his chest. Not all battles were fought with a blade. Some raged within, noiseless and ceaseless. At the edge of sleep, Aldrich heard a rustle. He opened his eyes slowly, hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. There, standing among the brambles, was a figure cloaked in white. It stood motionless, as though carved from mist. The moonlight caught upon its form, and Aldrich could see the gentle rise and fall of its breath. He did not rise nor draw his weapon. "Who walks the forest by night?" he asked, his voice low. The figure tilted its head. "A keeper of stories, a seeker of those who have forgotten theirs." The voice was that of a woman, soft, ageless, echoing faintly as though spoken through the veil of time. She stepped forward, revealing a face that was neither young nor old, marked not by years but by sorrow and wisdom. Her eyes, pale as morning frost, met his. "I know you, Sir Aldrich of Hearthwyn," she said. He did not speak. He waited. "You carry the weight of many lives, some taken, some left behind." He gave a slow nod. "That is a knight's burden." "But not his alone," she whispered. "Come, walk with me." Aldrich rose. He did not feel fear, only a quiet curiosity, as though he had stumbled into a dream from which he did not wish to wake. He followed her deeper into the forest, where the trees grew older and the mist thickened into veils. They walked in silence for a time, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant call of a night bird. She led him to a glade where a small pool shimmered like glass, fed by a trickling spring. Stones had been placed in a circle around it, moss-covered and ancient. It was a place of memory. That much was clear. The woman knelt by the pool. "Look into the water and tell me what you see." Aldrich did so. At first he saw only his reflection, tired eyes, hollow cheeks, the thin scar along his brow. But then the image changed. The surface of the pool shimmered, and he saw scenes from his past. His squirehood beneath Lord Braith, the laughter of Edrin as they raced horses across the fields, the first man he had slain, face twisted in pain and disbelief. He turned away. "You need not fear your past," the woman said gently. "It has already passed through you." "But it remains," he murmured. "Each memory is a stone in my armor, and I am drowning beneath the weight." She looked at him with great tenderness. "Then let us unburden you, piece by piece." The moon had risen high, casting silver light upon the glade. Aldrich sat beside her, and for the first time in many years he began to speak, not as a knight nor as a commander, but as a man. He spoke of his mother, whose lullabies still echoed in the corners of his mind, of his father, stern and distant, of the blood-soaked banners and the hollow victories, and of the fear that he had become something less than human. The woman listened, saying little, her presence as steady as the ancient stones. When he fell silent, exhausted from the unraveling of his own heart, she reached into the pool and drew forth a small vial filled with the spring's water. "Drink," she said. He hesitated only a moment before lifting it to his lips. The water was cool and clear, tasting faintly of earth and time. It slid down his throat, and with it came a strange sensation, as though something heavy had shifted within him. Not vanished, but moved, eased. "You are not meant to carry it all," she said, "but you are meant to remember, to tell the stories of those who cannot speak." Aldrich looked at her, and though he did not fully understand, he nodded. By dawn, the woman was gone. He stood alone in the glade, the pool still and glassy. Felwyn waited at the edge of the trees, ears twitching. Aldrich returned to the saddle, and for the first time in weeks, his posture was less burdened, his gaze steady. The road ahead was long, but something had changed within him. Not peace, but perhaps the beginning of it. The mist hung low upon the vale as Sir Aldrich emerged from the ancient glade, his cloak dampened by the dew that clung to every blade of grass. The memory of the pale woman, with her frost-laced voice and mournful eyes, lingered in his mind like the last notes of a chant long faded into silence. He did not question her reality, whether spirit or mortal, dream or divine. Her words had rooted deep, stirring a silence in his soul he had not known before. Felwyn moved with gentle purpose now, her hooves barely making a sound as they passed through the forest's thinning edge. The trees gave way to low, rolling fields where wildflowers bloomed even as the chill of autumn began to bite. Aldrich pressed onward, the sun rising behind him in pale gold, casting his shadow long across the grass. He rode eastward toward the monastery of St. Valen, a place known for its ancient library and the brothers who devoted their lives to the recording of histories, both sacred and secular. It was said the monks there could find the name of every knight ever anointed in the kingdom of Albret, and even those whose oaths had been lost to the centuries. Aldrich sought not knowledge, but silence, and perhaps the company of men who had turned their backs on war. The monastery stood atop a small hill, its stone walls weathered by wind and rain. As he approached, he could hear the gentle peal of a morning bell, its tone not one of urgency but of rhythm, calling the brothers to their prayers. The gates creaked open at his knock, revealing a robed figure whose face bore the tranquility of long-held peace. "Welcome, traveler," the monk said, bowing his tonsured head. "What do you seek at St. Valen?" "Shelter," Aldrich replied, "and quiet." The monk studied him a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the sword strapped across Aldrich's back. He said nothing, only nodded and gestured for him to enter. The courtyard was simple, lined with herbs and shaded by a great walnut tree. The air was scented with lavender and old parchment, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves and the quiet shuffle of sandaled feet. They gave Aldrich a small chamber with a narrow cot, a basin of fresh water, and a single beeswax candle. He remained there for the better part of 3 days, speaking little, eating sparingly, his time consumed with long walks among the cloisters and the occasional low-spoken exchange with the elder brothers. None questioned his presence. They were men who knew how to read silence. On the 4th morning, Brother Haran, a gray-bearded scribe with ink-stained fingers, approached Aldrich in the scriptorium. The room was filled with scrolls and bound manuscripts, some so old their edges crumbled when touched. Haran placed a small volume before him. "You asked for quiet, Sir Knight," he said softly, "but quiet is not always silence. It is the space in which a voice may return to itself. Perhaps you should write." Aldrich looked at the book. Its pages were blank. He opened it slowly, feeling the texture of the parchment, the promise of unspoken things. He had not held a quill in many years. His life had been lived in steel and mud, not ink, but the suggestion struck something within him. He nodded, and Haran left him there with a nod of his own, like a shepherd trusting the flock to the pasture. The days that followed were unlike any Aldrich had known. Each morning began with the soft tolling of bells, followed by simple meals, porridge, bread, and watered wine. Then came hours of silence, save for the scratching of quills and the turning of pages. Aldrich found himself returning to the scriptorium each day, opening his blank volume and writing not of battles, but of the spaces between them. He wrote of the squire who once stitched his wounds in the dark of night, hands trembling, of the maiden who had waited 3 winters for his return before marrying another, of the soft laughter of children in villages he had passed through, unaware of how closely death had brushed their rooftops. The words came slowly at first, like water drawn from a deep well, but soon they flowed, and Aldrich found himself consumed by the act of remembrance. In that quiet chamber, the brutal life of a knight began to soften at its edges. The pain remained, but it was now a part of a larger tapestry, a story not of glory or gore, but of a man who had walked through fire and now sought to understand the ashes he carried. One evening, as dusk painted the walls with gold, Brother Haran returned. "You've been writing," he said, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Would you share?" Aldrich hesitated, then nodded. He opened the volume, now filled with his careful hand, and began to read aloud. His voice was low, each word a stone carefully placed. When he finished, the scribe sat for a long time in silence. "You have borne witness," Haran said at last, "and in doing so, you have begun to heal." Aldrich closed the book. "I do not know if I will ever be whole." "No man is," the monk said, "but you are no longer just a sword. That is a beginning." Outside, the sky had darkened. The brothers moved in a quiet procession to evening prayers, their chants rising like mist through the cold air. Aldrich watched them from the doorway, the candlelight dancing upon their faces, and he felt something stir within, a faint warmth like embers beneath snow. That night, he dreamed of Edrin not as he had died, but as he had once been, young and laughing, racing across sunlit fields, his tunic fluttering behind him like a banner. And for the first time in many nights, Aldrich did not wake with a cry. The days at St. Valen folded into one another like pages of a well-worn book, gentle, deliberate, and untouched by the rush of the world beyond its stone walls. Sir Aldrich lingered there longer than he had intended. The brothers did not press him to leave, nor did they speak often of the outside realm. In their silence, they offered something deeper than counsel, a space to be human. Yet the world does not forget those who have borne the mantle of war. It was a morning painted in silver mist when the messenger arrived. A young man, pale-faced and breathless, his cloak torn by bramble and his boots caked in travel's wear. He did not stride boldly through the gate, but rather stumbled to his knees before Brother Harun, clutching a sealed letter bearing the crest of House Lorenthal, a silver hawk upon a crimson field. Harun received it with solemn hands, and after reading, turned to seek Aldrich without delay. He found the knight walking among the orchard trees, where apples hung low and the air was thick with the scent of ripening fruit. Aldrich's sword was strapped across his back as always, but he moved without urgency, as though his soul had grown roots in the monastery soil. Harun approached, letter in hand. "There has been a summons," the old scribe said quietly. "Your name is spoken again in halls of power." Aldrich accepted the letter, breaking the seal with a practiced thumb. The words were terse, composed in the angular script of a courtier. Lord Roderick of Lorenthal called upon Sir Aldrich of Hearthwind to serve once more, not with sword, but as witness, to adjudicate a dispute of blood between noble houses, where old alliances frayed at the edges of civility. "It is not a summons to war," Harun said, watching him, "but neither is it peace." Aldrich folded the letter and looked to the eastern horizon, where the hills rolled gently toward a world he had almost forgotten. "They do not call for the man I am," he murmured. "They call for the man I was." "Perhaps," Harun agreed, "but perhaps they need to hear from the man you've become." There was no command within the message, only a request wrapped in expectation. Yet Aldrich knew there were debts he still owed, not to lords or crowns, but to the truth of who he had once vowed to be. And so, with the first light of dawn the next day, he mounted Felwyn once more, his small, leather-bound journal packed among his few belongings. The road to Lorenthal was long, winding through harvest fields where peasants stooped to gather the last sheaves of wheat. Aldrich passed through villages quiet with the hush of change, where people watched him with cautious curiosity, some recognizing the crest upon his cloak, others only seeing the weathered knight with eyes like distant storm clouds. He arrived at Castle Lorenthal under a sky of heavy gray, the air thick with the scent of smoke from early hearth fires. The castle stood broad and low, its battlements not reaching for the heavens, but sprawling like a crouched beast. It was a stronghold of old blood and older pride, built not to impress, but to endure. Lord Roderick received him in the Hall of Justice, a long chamber flanked by carved stone pillars, where banners hung limp in the still air. The lord was a man of formidable stature, his beard streaked with gray and his voice low with the gravity of years. There was no warmth in his greeting, but neither was there disdain. "Sir Aldrich," he said, motioning to a seat beside him, "you are known to be a man of iron, but also of honor. That is why I called you." Aldrich inclined his head, but said nothing. A dispute had arisen, Roderick explained, between House Ellen and House Brevrant, neighbors whose fates had long been intertwined through land and marriage. A hunting accident, a boy slain by an errant arrow, had unraveled what little peace remained. There were claims of murder, of dishonor, of betrayal. The young heir of Brevrant now stood accused, and Ellen demanded blood in return. "I cannot judge this with clear eyes," Roderick confessed. "My kin are tangled in both lines, but you, Sir Aldrich, you have no stake. Your sword is respected, but your word carries the weight of a man who has seen too much to lie." Aldrich accepted the task not out of duty, but because he felt, in the marrow of his bones, that perhaps this was what the pale woman in the forest had meant, to speak for those who had no voice, to see with the eyes of one who knew how war began and how it could end. He spent the days that followed in quiet investigation, speaking with witnesses, examining the site of the incident, and listening, truly listening, to the grief of both families. The mother of the slain boy wept into her hands, not for vengeance, but for understanding. The accused heir, barely a man, trembled beneath the weight of accusation, insisting it had been a mistake, a moment's misjudgment on a fog-laced morning. Aldrich found himself wandering the edge of the woods where the boy had died. The ground still bore the faint impressions of hooves, the broken shaft of an arrow buried in the underbrush. He knelt there a long time, fingers brushing the dirt as though hoping to read the truth written in the earth. When the day of judgment arrived, the hall was filled. Nobles and commoners alike came to see how the knight would weigh the matter. Aldrich stood alone before them, without armor, without banners. He spoke simply. He told them what he had seen, what he had heard. He spoke not only of facts, but of the truths that live in the hearts of men. The terror of a boy who had taken a life by mistake, the sorrow of a mother who had lost her child, the danger of vengeance cloaked in righteousness. And then he laid down a parchment with his ruling. The heir of Brevrant would live, but he would spend 3 winters in the service of St. Valen's monastery, laboring and learning, giving back to the world he had wounded. The 2 houses would seal peace not with blood, but with a solemn vow to build a chapel on the site of the death, where prayers could be offered by both lines for as long as they endured. There was silence in the hall. Then, slowly, Lord Roderick rose and nodded. So be it. Aldrich left Lorenthal that night, under a sky of velvet stars. He did not return to the monastery, nor yet to any familiar place. He rode on, the road unwinding before him like a song yet to be sung, his journal tied to his saddle, and the memory of justice, not perfect, but perhaps merciful, settled quietly in his chest. The wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and distant heather as Sir Aldrich ventured northward, the rugged hills of the frontier rising like sleeping giants before him. There were no banners in this land, no noble houses vying for honor or influence, only villages nestled in narrow valleys, watched over by cairns of stone and the quiet vigilance of shepherds. He had no destination. The road guided him now, not purpose nor command. Each step his horse took felt drawn by something unseen, a whisper in the breeze, a pull in the chest. He passed through hamlets where his name was unknown, where children stared at the steel across his back but said nothing, where elders nodded with the solemnity of those who knew the weight of a stranger's silence. One such village, Brenna Hollow, welcomed him in the hush of twilight. It was a place built of timber and patience, its homes low and weathered, their thatched roofs streaked with moss. Smoke curled gently from hearths, and the air carried the sweet tang of burning peat. Aldrich dismounted without ceremony, approaching the inn with the quiet gait of a man long removed from ceremony or acclaim. The innkeeper, a round-shouldered man with deep lines about his eyes, greeted him with a slow nod. "You're far from the roads most traveled," he remarked. "I seek no roads," Aldrich replied, "only rest." He was offered a room and a simple supper, barley stew and dark bread, a cup of mead thick with honey. In the corner of the inn, a fiddler played a tune so soft it felt more memory than music. Aldrich listened, his hands wrapped around the warm cup, the ache in his shoulders deep but familiar. Later, as he sat near the hearth, the innkeeper returned. "There's a thing," he said, glancing toward the window, "that you may wish to hear of. Our village's trouble. It's not a night's concern, perhaps, but no harm in asking." Aldrich met his gaze with quiet interest. "Tell me." The innkeeper settled beside him, voice lowered. "There's been something amiss in the hills. Our flocks vanish, not butchered, not stolen, gone without sign, no tracks, no blood, just silence. A stillness in the air. Folks say it's the old place, Hymir Hollow, a cairn there, from before the lords came, built by hands we do not name." Aldrich listened, eyes narrowing slightly. He knew such tales. Places left to time, feared not for what they were, but for what memory said they might be. He did not laugh, nor dismiss it. Fear, even ancient fear, bore meaning. "Have you seen it yourself?" he asked. "No, nor would I," the man replied. "But an old widow, Mara, says her grandson wandered too close, came back silent, stares at the wall, won't speak, eats little, sleeps not at all." That night, Aldrich stood beneath the sky, the stars dulled by a wisping fog that clung to the valley like a breath held too long. Failwind grazed nearby, calm but alert. The knight gazed northward, toward the hills beyond the fields, where shadows grew thick and the land whispered of things long buried. In the morning, he rode alone toward Hymir Hollow. The path was scarcely more than a trail beaten by deer and wandering sheep. Bracken grew thick on either side, and the trees that crowned the hills were twisted by wind and age. Birds did not sing. The only sound was the creak of his saddle and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by an unseen current. As he crested the ridge, the hollow opened before him. There, in the center of a ring of pale stones, stood the cairn. It rose like a frozen wave of stone, massive, ancient, its surface scarred by time and lichen. No birds circled above. No wind stirred its base. The air was thick, still, as though breath itself paused in reverence. Aldrich dismounted. He walked forward slowly, each step pressing into soil soft as ash. At the foot of the cairn lay remnants, scraps of wool, broken bones of small beasts, a twisted wooden charm whose runes had long since faded. He knelt, brushing aside the dirt with a gauntleted hand. There were markings beneath the moss. Not runes, not letters, but patterns. Spirals, knots, eyes wide and unblinking. The kind of art carved not to be read, but to be remembered. He felt the air shift. A low hum, just beneath hearing, pulsed through the earth. Aldrich rose and placed a hand upon the cairn stone. It was cold, not with the chill of winter, but with the emptiness of something untouched by warmth for centuries. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw a flicker, firelight dancing on stone, figures moving in ritual, and a voice, not human, speaking in a cadence older than language. He pulled away, breath sharp. Behind him, Felwyn neighed softly. When he returned to the village, the dusk had already fallen. The innkeeper met him at the stable. "Well," he asked, "the cairn has not forgotten its purpose," Aldrich said simply. "But I do not think it is malice that stirs there. Only hunger. It must be sated, or it will grow restless." He did not offer explanation, only instruction. That night, he gathered the villagers in the square. With solemn voice, he told them to return what was taken, offerings of grain, of bone, of flame and song. Not worship, but remembrance. The old places, he said, were not evil, only forgotten. And in forgetting, man had broken pacts he did not understand. They did as he asked. By morning, the boy had spoken his first words in days. "The stones were watching," he whispered, "but now they sleep." Aldrich left Brenna Hollow before the sun rose fully, his silhouette vanishing into the gray mist once more. He left no name behind, no tale told in the inn's hearth-lit corners. Only a silence gentler than before. Only peace, where once there had been fear. And so the road wound on, carrying the night forward, toward no banner, toward no war, only the endless rhythm of the land and the slow unfolding of the man he was becoming. The frost arrived quietly in the night, weaving itself across the countryside with delicate fingers of silver. Sir Aldrich awoke to find the fields dusted in white, the grass brittle beneath Felwyn's hooves as they moved through a land now hushed by the coming of winter. The trees stood bare, their branches etched against a pale sky, and even the rivers seemed to flow more slowly, their edges rimmed with thin sheets of ice. The knight drew his cloak tighter, the wool thick upon his shoulders, the hood drawn low to shield his eyes from the bite of the wind. His path now led him east, along the forgotten trade roads that once connected prosperous towns, now little more than crumbling milestones and moss-covered stones where wayfarers once rested. There was a loneliness to the road, but Aldrich welcomed it. In solitude, there was a certain kind of truth. He spent his nights beneath the stars, his campfire small, and his meals simpler still. The journal he kept, once a reluctant endeavor, had grown thick with ink and memory. He wrote by firelight, his quill scratching out not tales of glory, but recollections of faces and voices, of the fleeting kindnesses that lingered longer than the clamor of war. It was in such a moment, one dusky eve as snow began to fall in soft spirals from a pearl-gray sky, that Aldrich stumbled upon the ruins of Valmere Priory. The priory had long been abandoned. The stone chapel stood without roof, its walls bowed by centuries of wind and rain. Ivy and frost curled over its worn altar, and the statue of Saint Ella, patroness of mercy, had lost her eyes to time, though her face remained serene. Aldrich dismounted and stepped through the archway, boots crunching softly on the frozen earth. There was no sign of recent passage, no footprints, no ash, no offerings, but something about the air felt reverent, as though memory still lingered in the bones of the place. He set camp within the shelter of the ruined walls. That night, as snow blanketed the world in silence, Aldrich lit a single candle on the altar. Not out of piety, but out of respect. For the prayers once whispered here, for the hands that once built and believed, for those who had laid down sword and burden and chosen peace. he dreamed beneath the vaulted sky. In his dream, the priory was whole once more. Bells tolled softly from a tower above, and robed figures moved through corridors lit by stained glass light. A woman walked among them, her face veiled, her voice gentle as she recited the prayers of the dead. Aldrich followed her silently, drawn not by duty, but by sorrow. When she turned to face him, her veil lifted not by wind, but by memory. It was Lady Eleonora, the woman he had once sworn to protect, and failed. She looked upon him not with reproach, but with the deep sadness of a soul who has seen all things. Her voice, when it came, was not accusation, but lament. "You carry ghosts, Aldrich," she said, "but they do not carry you." He awoke just before dawn. The snow had stopped, and the sky was stained in hues of lilac and rose. He sat for a long while beside the candle, now melted to a stub, and felt a strange stillness in his chest. Not joy, nor grief, but the fragile in-between, like the breath one holds just before a prayer. He departed Valmere with care, leaving the ruins as he had found them. Further along the road, he came upon a traveler, a young woman wrapped in a patchwork cloak, her cheeks red with cold, and her eyes bright with purpose. She hailed him with caution, one hand resting on a small knife at her belt. "I mean no harm," she said quickly. "Only company, if you'll allow it." Aldrich nodded, and they walked together beneath the winter sun. Her name was Sira, and she was a healer's apprentice from a village lost to a recent fire. She traveled now to find her kin in the distant province of Glesmere. As they journeyed, she told him stories, not of war, but of herbs and salves, of old women who brewed memory into tea, of children who learned to whistle with leaves. She spoke with the frankness of the young and the weariness of one who had seen too much too soon. Aldrich listened and found her voice to be a balm against the cold. One evening, as they shared a fire near the banks of a frozen stream, Sira asked, "Were you always a knight?" Aldrich stared into the flames. "No," he said after a long silence. "Once I was a boy who wanted to be brave. Then I became a man who wished only to survive." She considered this, then nodded. "Then perhaps now you are something else entirely." They parted at the fork where the road bent south toward Glesmere. Sira pressed a small bundle into his hand, dried herbs wrapped in linen. "For your sleep," she said. "You dream too loudly." He watched her vanish down the bend, her cloak flaring behind her like a banner. For a moment Aldrich felt a pang of something he could not name, longing, perhaps, or simply the ache of parting. He tucked the bundle into his satchel and turned once more toward the unknown. That night he lit another candle, and as he wrote in his journal, he paused over the words, "I am no longer just a sword." Outside, snow began to fall once more. Not harshly, but like a lullaby, covering the road behind him and softening the world ahead. The road bent through the northern reaches now, rising steadily into the highlands where winter showed no mercy. The land became starker. Fields of brittle grass stretched between slopes of jagged stone, and the sky often remained overcast for days at a time, casting the world into a dim and pewter-toned quiet. Sir Aldrich pressed onward, the wind stinging his cheeks and the cold seeping even through layers of wool and leather. He passed fewer travelers here. The occasional shepherd, wrapped in furs and silence, offered only a nod of recognition. Villages were scattered and small, their smoke rising thin and pale into the sky like lost prayers. Aldrich slept in stables in abandoned way stations, or sometimes not at all, the frost coating his cloak by morning as he rose from his bedroll like a man exhumed. He came, at last, to the outskirts of a place called Dunmarrow, a hill town clinging to the shoulder of an ancient ridge, where the stone houses seemed born of the rock itself. The people here spoke little and watched much, their eyes weary, as though they had long ago grown accustomed to the company of sorrow. Aldrich sought no welcome, only shelter, and was granted it by a widow who kept a humble inn carved halfway into the hillside. Her name was Mara, her hair white as milk, her movements slow but purposeful. She asked no questions. She only gestured toward a hearth already lit and left him to the warmth. On the second night, when a hush fell over the inn and the fire had dwindled to embers, Mara sat across from him, a cup of hot elderberry wine in her hands. "You've not asked about the howling," she said, voice rasped with age. Aldrich looked up from the journal in his lap. "I've heard it. In the wind." She shook her head slowly. "Not the wind, Sir Knight. The moor beasts. They've returned." He listened, setting the quill aside. They come down from the high fells when the cold bites deepest, shadows with eyes like coals. They take the lambs first, then the dogs. And then, sometimes, those who wander too far from their homes, always at dusk, always when the bells refuse to ring. Aldrich had heard tales like these before, wolves given too much legend, winter madness turned into superstition. But something in Mara's tone rooted deeper. There was no fear in her voice, only resignation, as though the horror was not imagined but endured. "I will ride out at dawn," he said simply. Mara didn't thank him. She only nodded, and for the rest of the night said nothing more. Come morning, Aldrich left the warmth of the inn and took the narrow trail that led into the high moors, an expanse of heather, frost, and stone, endless and empty. Failwind stepped carefully across the uneven terrain, her breath rising in white plumes. The wind here was constant, a thin, wailing thing that seemed to speak through every crevice and crag. Hours passed, the sky remaining a dull gray above. He found no tracks, no signs of the so-called beasts, only silence and the slow pull of cold on his limbs. Yet just as the light began to wane and the hills turned blue with evening shadow, Failwind halted. Her ears twitched, her muscles tensed. Then Aldrich heard it. A low, throaty sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It echoed across the stones, carried by the wind, but not of it. He dismounted slowly, drawing his sword, though even as he did so, he knew steel might not serve him here. The sound came again, and from the ridge above, movement, 4 shapes, hunched and swift, darting across the horizon like phantoms. They did not resemble wolves. They moved like men, but loped like beasts, their limbs too long, their silhouettes jagged against the fading sky. Aldrich stood still. He made no move to engage. Instead, he watched. One of the figures paused, turning its head. Even at a distance, Aldrich saw its eyes, red and smoldering like embers buried in ash. They vanished moments later into the mist that pooled in the valleys. He returned to Dunmarrow under the cloak of night, his mind heavy with unease. Back at the inn, Mara waited by the fire. "They saw you," she said without question. "Yes," Aldrich replied, "but they did not strike." She sipped her wine. "They remember the old accords, perhaps, or perhaps they wait for something more precious than one wandering night." Aldrich sat in silence. "There was a pact once," she continued after a pause. "Long before the lords came, a gift offered each winter, grain, blood, song. The song was most important. It kept them away." "What changed?" Aldrich asked. "The old singers died," Mara said, eyes on the fire, "and no one remembered the tune." The next day, Aldrich sought out the village's eldest, a blind man named Tommel, who had lived through 9 winters more than any other soul in Dunmarrow. Tommel's house smelled of dried herbs and smoke, his voice reedy and cracked. "A song, is it?" Tommel muttered. "Aye, I remember part, just a line or two, but the rest lost with my mother's breath." He hummed a fragment, low, lilting, full of sorrow. It was no hymn of triumph. It was a lullaby, meant not to banish, but to soothe. Aldrich memorized the notes. That evening, he returned to the moors, alone. He brought no torch, no blade in hand, only his voice. He stood upon a high rock as dusk deepened and the mist rose. Then into the vast silence, he sang. The song was broken, incomplete, yet something in the wind shifted. The howl that answered him was not of hunger, but of memory. The shadows remained distant, their shapes moving slowly, like mourners passing through a graveyard. He sang until his voice cracked. And when silence returned, he remained still, letting the cold wash over him like absolution. The moor beasts did not come again that winter. And when Aldrich left Dunmarrow days later, he left behind not only peace, but the first line of a forgotten song, now humming once more upon the lips of children. The thaw came slowly in the highlands, reluctant and unsure, as if winter had forgotten how to retreat. The snow did not melt, but withdrew inch by inch, leaving behind patches of blackened earth and pale shoots of green reaching tentatively toward a still graying sky. Sir Aldrich moved with the change in season, his path curling southward again, following the great river Tynevale as it wound its course between forest and field. The world seemed to be stirring from its long slumber. Birds returned in cautious 2s and 3s, singing brief melodies that felt more like questions than celebration. The villages, too, came slowly back to life, smoke rising more steadily from hearths, and the fields being turned once again by hands calloused from long disuse. Aldrich passed these scenes quietly, a specter on horseback, leaving little behind but hoof prints in the thawing mud. It was in such a season, between the last breath of winter and the first true sigh of spring, that he came upon the town of Wormsby. At first glance, Wormsby seemed no different than any other market town of middling size. Its gate was of timber, weathered but standing. Its walls were low, more for ceremony than defense, and the bells from the abbey still rang thrice daily, even if the tone had grown cracked with age. But there was a strangeness to the place that Aldrich felt at once, something beneath the surface, like tension in a drawn bow. The gatekeeper eyed him warily but did not halt his entry. A night was a rare sight, but not unwelcome. Inside, the streets were orderly and clean, though the people moved with downcast eyes and measured steps. No one lingered in conversation. No laughter broke the air. The market was quiet. Those stalls were full. And the children played not with wild shouts, but in careful silence. Aldrich stopped at the apothecary, seeking a remedy for the cough that had taken hold in his chest. The woman who served him, bent-backed with silver-streaked hair, glanced at his sword and lowered her voice. "You carry steel," she said. "You'd best keep it sheathed come sundown." "Why?" Aldrich asked. She didn't look up. "Because they listen." Aldrich left with his tinctures but lingered near the abbey, where an old monk swept the stones of the courtyard. The monk, too, was guarded in speech, but his age gave him a certain disregard for fear. "There's a curse on this town," he murmured when Aldrich asked, "not of plague or beast, but of silence, of promises broken and things not buried deep enough." He explained in fragments, the tale of a knight who had once ridden through Wormsby many generations past, bearing a prisoner of strange appearance and stranger nature. The knight, a man of fierce renown, had not heeded the pleas of the abbess nor the warnings of the wise. He imprisoned the figure in the catacombs beneath the abbey, locking it behind iron and prayer. But he did not stay, the monk whispered. He rode on, proud and deaf, and what he left behind remained. Each generation since had lived in the shadow of that silence. Some years, nothing stirred. Other times, strange dreams, missing children, voices echoing in empty rooms. No one spoke of it openly. No one dared open the lower doors of the abbey. Aldrich spent that night in the chapel's guest chamber, the stone walls cool against his back. He slept lightly, but dreams came anyway. He stood once more beneath the boughs of the yew tree from his youth, its limbs heavy with shadow. In the dream, he was not a knight, nor even a man, but a boy again, barefoot in the forest, a wooden sword in hand. The wind whispered his name. When he turned, he saw a figure cloaked in darkness, its shape shifting like smoke, its face hidden behind a mask carved from bone. It raised a hand, and in a voice like wind through graveyard grass, it said, "You will unseal what others feared." Aldrich woke in silence, heart steady, breath calm. Dreams could be warnings or merely echoes, but something within him, something deeper than doubt, told him the catacombs needed to be seen. He spoke with the abbess in the gray light of morning. She was a woman of iron poise, her face a map of worry lines and sleepless nights. At first, she refused. "It is not for us to disturb what was sealed," she said. "It is not disturbed," Aldrich answered gently, "if it has never slept." She considered him a long time, and then, with a sigh born of too many nights fearing the sun's rise, she gave him the key. The entrance was narrow and steep, carved into the earth beneath the altar itself. The torch Aldrich carried guttered in the stagnant air. Dust clung thick to the walls, and the smell was one of stone and damp regret. He moved slowly, every step deliberate, his other hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. At the bottom, he found the door. It was not large, but it was old. Iron-bound oak, sealed with rivets and a chain that had long rusted into the wall. Upon its surface were etched strange marks, not script but symbols, foreign and looping, each one drawn by a hand uncertain yet compelled. Aldrich knelt. He did not break the chain. He did not speak. Instead, he placed his hand upon the door and whispered the first line of the Moor song he had learned not weeks before. A soft breath exhaled from the cracks in the wood, and then silence. Not a threat, not a presence, only listening. He rose, bowed once, and left the catacombs as he had found them. The people of Wormsby never asked what he did, and he never told them. But after that night, the market grew a touch louder. The children played more freely. And once, in the courtyard of the abbey, Aldrich heard a novice humming a tune he had never taught, but recognized. the tune of something once buried, now soothed. He left the town in the morning mist, the roads soft beneath Failwind's hooves. Behind him, the bells of the abbey rang clear, no longer cracked. Ahead, the path unfolded like parchment, blank and waiting. The night pressed onward, not toward battle or glory, but toward understanding, toward peace, wherever it might take root. The sun had begun to hang a little longer in the sky now, its golden fingers stroking the waking earth with a warmth that was not yet summer, but no longer winter's chill. The meadows returned to color, and along the road, the hedgerows brimmed with new life, songbirds darting through blossoming hawthorn, and bees returning to their quiet, ceaseless work. Sir Aldrich traveled onward, his pace unhurried, as if his very soul had grown attuned to the rhythm of the world's gentle turning. He had not spoken aloud in 3 days. There was no need. The land was enough. His thoughts no longer rushed in clamor as they once had, demanding distraction or drink. Now they unfolded like parchment left in sunlight, edges curling slowly, words revealing themselves with time. He passed a wayside shrine one morning, its stones warm from the early light. Set beside it was a garland of fresh wildflowers and a note tucked within, for safe passage, for unseen mercy. He lingered a while, laying his hand atop the weather-worn altar, and whispered nothing, for the gods of the road ask little more than presence. By midday, he reached the outskirts of a wide valley. Below, nestled against the river's bend, was a manor built of pale stone and red clay roofs, a place once grand, now quiet, its walls streaked with ivy and thyme. A wooden bridge arched across the stream, leading toward fields worked by laborers and a great orchard behind the house, where rows of apple trees stood like patient sentinels. Aldrich recognized it, not from maps or memory, but from the pages of a letter he had once kept in his satchel, a letter sent many winters ago by a man long dead. Sir Almar of Westmere, it had read, "If ever you find yourself adrift and without banner, come to our lands. You will find a welcome among trees, not towers. We ask not your sword, but your presence. That is enough." The letter had arrived while Aldrich was deep in campaign, buried beneath politics and blood. He had never answered it. The man who wrote it, Baron Elric of Ferden, had died within the year, and the manor passed into the hands of his widowed sister. Now, without war, without cause, Aldrich found himself at the edge of that very land. He dismounted, led Failwind across the bridge, and approached the manor gates. A steward met him, an older woman, her hair braided back beneath a linen coif, her eyes sharp with age-earned wisdom. She did not flinch at the sight of the sword. She only looked him over and said, "You're late." Aldrich bowed his head. I am." She said no more, only turned and led him through the gardens, where he found himself enveloped in birdsong and the heady scent of early blossom. The paths were lined with thyme and marjoram, their fragrance rising with each step. Children played among the hedges, chasing each other with wooden swords and cries of feigned battle. "Baroness Avelle will see you at the orchard," the steward said, and then left him to find his way. He walked beneath the flowering boughs until he came upon her, a woman cloaked in dark green, her silver hair braided and coiled atop her head. She stood beside one of the trees, pruning away winter's remains with calm, precise movements. "You are taller than I imagined," she said without turning, "and you speak as one who knew I was coming." "I hoped, not knew. Elric spoke of you often, said you carried silence better than most men carry gold." Aldrich stepped closer. He was kind. Too kind. Ivelle turned then, and her gaze met his. It was clear she had seen loss, lines etched deeply around her mouth, a softness in the eyes that comes only when one has looked long into grief and learned to live beside it. "You've no title now," she said. "No lord above you." "No," Aldrich replied. "Then stay a while. You've no need to pay us back. Let the trees teach you how to be still again." He nodded. And so for the first time in many years, Aldrich stayed. He took to walking the orchard each morning, carrying a basket for fallen fruit, helping with pruning, learning the shape of each tree, as one learns the lines of an old friend's face. The Baroness had a quiet estate, no knights, no court, only villagers and stewards, servants who sang at their work and spoke kindly in passing. In the evenings they gathered in the great hall, not for feasts, but for bread and broth, for stories told in low voices by the hearth. Aldrich said little, but listened to them all. One night, he told a tale of a siege, but not of the battle. He spoke instead of a stray dog who had wandered the walls, bringing laughter to the men as it stole their rations and slept beside the fire. Laughter returned to him that night. Light, cautious, like the first petal to bloom after frost. As days turned to weeks, the orchard came into full blossom. The air was thick with bees, and Aldrich found himself working beside children, helping mend fences and clean tools. A boy named Joran asked if he would teach him how to use a sword. Why? Aldrich asked, kneeling beside him. To protect, Joran said, eyes shining. Aldrich handed him a branch instead. Then first, you must learn to grow. He stayed through the season, and in that quiet, flowering place, something softened inside him, not a forgetting, but a yielding. The past no longer clawed at his heels. It sat beside him now, no longer demanding, but remembered. He dreamed of battle still, but the cries were fainter, the faces clearer. He saw them not as fallen, but as companions who had journeyed as far as they could. When the apple blossoms fell and the fruit began to swell green on the branch, Aldrich rose one morning and knew it was time. He packed his things in silence, left a small carving upon the Baroness's table, an apple shaped from yew wood. He saddled Felwyn and walked once more to the road. As he departed, Joran called after him. "What are you now?" Sir paused, then smiled. "Just Aldrich," he said, "and that is enough." The path southward stretched like a ribbon of dust and memory, winding through low valleys kissed by the early scent of lavender and warm stone. Sir Aldrich, no longer adorned with crest nor title, only name, rode with the ease of one unburdened by destination. He followed the sun each morning and the stars each night, trusting in silence to guide him as faithfully as any map. Felwyn moved with steady grace, her steps sure-footed on the gravel road. Together they passed shepherds tending lambs, mendicants chanting soft prayers at crossroads, and cart-bound families making slow, hopeful journeys toward the coast. Some greeted him with nods, others with cautious distance. None asked questions. There was a quiet recognition in his bearing, something that said, "This man has walked through fire and chosen not to burn." On the third day, the landscape changed again. The hills grew steeper, rising into granite shoulders that loomed against the sky. The air thinned and cooled, scented with pine and distant rain. Here, the road narrowed, climbing into the crags of the borderlands between the Old Kingdom and the wild reaches beyond. Few traveled this way now, less out of fear and more out of forgetting. That evening, Aldrich arrived at an outpost long abandoned. It stood crumbling at the edge of a cliff, its watchtower leaning like a tired sentinel gazing forever westward. The gate was rusted open, its iron twisted by time. Moss crept along the parapets, and birds nested in the arrow slits where once guards had stood in vigilant shifts. Aldrich dismounted, tethered Felwyn near a stone trough overgrown with fern, and stepped through the hollow archway. Inside, the barracks still bore the bones of old life. Broken cots, a hearth choked with soot, the remains of a rusted helm cast aside in a corner. Yet amid the ruin, there was peace. No echo of violence lingered here. Only absence. Only the stillness of a place waiting for someone to remember it had once mattered. Aldrich made a small fire and sat with his back to the wall. As night descended, the stars emerged like a crown of silver above the hills, each one burning with a quiet ferocity that made him feel both infinitesimal and utterly whole. He opened his journal, now thick with pages, and began to write, not of battle, not of sorrow, but of a girl he had once met beneath the flowering branches of a hawthorn tree. Her name had long slipped from his memory, but the way she had laughed, freely, without apology, remained. He wrote of her, of how, for one fleeting spring, she had made him believe the world could be soft. He slept without dreams. By morning, the weather had changed. Low clouds gathered like bruises upon the horizon, and the scent of coming storm swept up the slope. Aldrich saddled Felwyn and began his descent toward the valley below, hoping to find shelter before the skies opened. Halfway down the path, he found it. A hermitage carved into the cliffside, little more than a cave shaped by wind and hand, with a low door of woven branches and a circle of stones marked by soot. Smoke rose faintly from the fire ring. Someone lived here still. He dismounted and approached on foot, announcing himself with quiet steps. A voice called from within, rough but not unfriendly. "You bring steel but no threat. Come then." Inside, the cave was warmer than expected. lit by a single lantern and a small fire nestled beneath a cleft in the stone. A man sat cross-legged on a mat of old pelts, his hair white and his skin darkened by sun and years. His robes were plain, his eyes sharp with the calm of one who has let go of everything not necessary. He gestured for Aldrich to sit. "You're far from court," the hermit said, "but not from your ghosts." Aldrich studied him. "You were a knight once." "Aye," the man replied, smiling faintly. "Sir Renewald of Evenmark, before I shed the name like a skin." They shared tea brewed from mountain herbs, bitter and restorative. Renewald spoke little of his past, but his few words were weighty. He had served 3 kings, fought in 5 campaigns, and buried more friends than he could count. One day, after the last siege had broken and the banners were folded away, he had walked into the hills and simply stayed. "There is a kind of courage in laying down the sword," Renewald said. "Harder than taking it up." Aldrich nodded. "I'm learning that." "You still carry it." "I do." "Then perhaps you are still listening, not to orders, but to need." They spoke through the storm, which came swift and fierce, lashing the mountains with rain and wind. Within the cave, they were untouched, safe. The fire crackled and silence fell again, comfortable, complete. Before dawn, Aldrich prepared to leave. He stood at the mouth of the cave, the wind now calmed, the road shining with wet light. Renewald joined him, his staff in hand. "Go gently," he said. "The world will ask much of you, but remember, it is enough to stand, even if you do not fight." Aldrich bowed, a gesture not of fealty, but of respect. He rode on, the path turning once more through pine and fog, his thoughts steadier now. The storm had passed, and with it another layer of the armor he had long worn not against others, but against himself. And far below, in the valleys unseen, the road awaited, quiet, open, alive. The road took on a gentler curve as Aldrich descended from the highlands, the world unfurling before him like a tapestry rinsed clean by storm. Meadows stretched in patchwork greens and golds, stitched together by winding creeks that caught the sky's reflection in glimmers of blue. The air smelled of wet stone, sun-warmed grass, and the faint sweetness of apple blossom carried from far-off orchards. Felwyn walked with easy grace, no longer pressed by urgency or unrest. They moved not as fugitive and steed, nor even as knight and mount, but as 2 creatures bound by a quiet, shared understanding of the land, of silence, of the long, unwinding journey that had brought them here. By late afternoon, they crested a soft rise and saw a village nestled below, framed by old oaks and the slow curl of a river. Smoke drifted from chimneys, and in the fields, workers moved like patient notes in a lullaby. The place was called Elmbrook, though no signs announced it. It did not need to be known, only lived in. Aldrich arrived just as the bells of the chapel rang vespers, low and worn, their tones more memory than command. He tethered Felwyn beneath a chestnut tree, then stepped into the village square, where elders mended nets beside the well and children played at weaving daisy crowns. No one stared, and no one fled. A few glanced at the sword on his back, but there was no fear in their eyes, only curiosity. He found lodging at a weaver's house, a widow named Tamsin, whose quiet dignity spoke of a life long lived among wool and wind and the slow rhythms of earth. She offered him bread, stew, and a cot by the hearth, asking no questions save one. "Do you seek something, or have you left something behind?" He thought for a long while before answering. "Both." She nodded as if that were the only answer worth giving. The days passed like water over smooth stone. Aldrich stayed, not from indecision, but from the rare feeling that the land itself asked him to linger. He helped where he could, splitting logs, fixing roofs, watching children when their parents walked to market. The village had no need of a sword, and so he wore it less often, letting it rest beneath his bed like an old memory. One morning, as the mist still clung to the hedgerows, he was summoned by the village elder, a man named Corwin, whose age was counted more by stories than seasons. Corwin walked with a cane carved from hawthorn, and his eyes were sharp despite their clouded hue. "You've a calm about you," Corwin said as they sat beneath the old elm in the square, "but not peace, not yet." Aldrich did not deny it. "There's a place not far," the elder continued, "a glade beyond the river bend where the old paths meet. Some say it's just a clearing. Others, that it remembers." "Remembers what?" Aldrich asked. "Whatever you bring to it." That evening, Aldrich walked alone to the glade. The sun was setting, its light filtering through the trees in long amber shafts. The air grew still as he approached, and the sounds of the world faded. The insects quieted, the wind hushed. Only the rustle of leaves beneath his boots and the steady thrum of his heart remained. The glade was unremarkable, and yet perfect in its simplicity. A circle of grass surrounded by elder trees, their roots curling like the hands of sleeping giants. At the center stood a stone, half buried, weathered by time. Upon its surface was no inscription, but a single groove worn deep, as though many fingers had traced the same path over generations. Aldrich sat beside it. He did not speak. He did not pray. He only breathed. And in that breath, he felt something shift. Not in the air, but within. A soft unspooling of tension. The lifting of a weight he hadn't known still pressed on his shoulders. He saw, in the theater of his memory, all the faces that had followed him through the years. Not only the dead, but the forgotten. Squires who had looked up to him. Foes who had fallen with honor. A father who had never said his name with pride. A brother who had died before they could reconcile. He saw them all, and one by one, he let them go. He returned to the village well after moonrise, his steps lighter than they had been in years. Tamsin met him at the threshold of her cottage, offering no words, only a cup of warm milk and a nod that said she understood. The next morning, Aldrich rose before the sun. He packed his things in silence, leaving behind a small pouch of coins and something else, a ribbon, once tied around a letter he had carried since the war. A keepsake of a time long past, now no longer needed. He saddled Failwyn and looked once more upon the sleeping village. Then he rode on, the path opening like a story still unfinished. Not as a knight, not as a penitent, but as a man who had finally begun to forgive himself. Of course. Here's part 19 of the story. Successfully created text document Medieval Knight PT19, which will be referenced in all future messages with a unique identifier TextDocSor ID 6858C609D D81918C4A6E352D739. Part 19 is complete. Of course. Here's part 20 of the story. In the stillness of the woods beyond Valabrook, where the last breath of winter clung to the trees like ancient whispers, Sir Aldrich rode slowly beneath the tangled canopy. The sky above was a dull pewter, clouds stretched thin and weary, the light cold and pale as if the sun itself mourned the silence that blanketed the land. Every hoofbeat sounded like a drum in a vast cathedral, echoing into the hush. The forest, usually alive with the chatter of birds and rustle of leaves, had fallen into a breathless vigil, as though nature itself was watching him. He had not spoken in hours. Since departing from the Abbey of St. Halwyn, where he had received final rites and a meager meal from a brother too kind for such a cruel world, he had traveled alone. The weight of the coming days pressed upon his shoulders as heavily as his hauberk. He was not a young man, nor truly old, but he felt as though he carried centuries within him. Each scar a scroll of memory, each joint an archive of war. Aldrich had returned to his home country not to reclaim lands or seek vengeance, but to fulfill the promise he had once made to an old comrade beneath a sky split by thunder. He was seeking the tomb of Sir Elric of Branton, whose name had been all but forgotten, save for by Aldrich himself and a few fading pages buried in the monastery's dust-choked scriptorium. Elric had died saving his life during the Battle of Mirefield, a place whose fields now bore only thistles and the bones of those the world had long stopped mourning. The journey took him across a land that felt no longer his. Villages he once knew were now charred skeletons or ghostly husks with shuttered homes and wary eyes peering from cracks in the walls. The plague had come and gone, leaving behind silence where laughter once echoed. Even the children's voices were rare, and when heard, they came like echoes from another world. He rode past a crumbled wayside cross and paused. Dismounting, he knelt before it, his gauntleted hand brushing away moss and lichen from the carved stone Christ. He whispered no prayer, but his silence spoke deeply. There were no miracles for knights like him, only the long path of atonement that led through cold, mud, and memory. Night came quietly, its veil dropped without grandeur. Aldrich set camp in the hollow of a copse where the trees curved protectively like old guardians. He made no fire, only bread and cheese from his satchel, stale and dry, but enough. He chewed slowly, staring into the dark, listening. The forest crackled and shifted, not threatening but alive in its slumber. In his mind, faces flickered, men lost to time, those who had once sat with him beneath stars just like these, some laughing, others solemn, all now gone. He pulled his cloak tighter, grateful for the rough wool. From beneath it, he withdrew a folded scrap of parchment, weather-worn and ink-smudged. Elric's last letter. He had read it 100 times and would likely read it 100 more. It spoke not of battle nor glory, but of a desire to see Branton once more, to walk beside the River Elny, and to taste his mother's apple bread. Simple things, beautiful, lost things. Sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by the clatter of memory. At dawn, he woke stiff and cold, his breath a cloud. He rubbed life back into his fingers, fed his horse, and resumed the path. The road to Branton had long since disappeared beneath root and bramble, but Aldrich remembered the terrain well enough, guided more by instinct than sight. By mid-morning, a low stone wall emerged through the trees, cracked and weather-beaten, half swallowed by ivy. Beyond it lay Branton, or what remained. The village was barely more than a ruin now. Thatched roofs had caved in, doors hung askew, and only the church spire stood defiant, its bell long silenced. Aldrich dismounted and led his horse through the ruined gate. Every step echoed through him, each a bell tolling in his chest. He remembered the street, remembered the little square where Elric's sister had once sung on Midsummer's Eve. The bakery with the crooked chimney was now only stone and ash. He found the graveyard behind the church, overgrown and tangled with bramble. With reverent care, he began clearing the thorns, reading what names still stood the test of time. He searched until the sun was nearly swallowed by the horizon, casting long shadows that crawled like specters across the mossy earth. At last, near a tree gnarled with age and hollowed by lightning, he found it, a simple stone half sunken, the carving nearly worn smooth. Sir Elric of Branton, loyal unto the end. Aldrich knelt before it, head bowed. For a long time he did not move. The wind sang a low hymn through the trees, and for a moment he could almost hear Elric's voice, young, strong, laughing. He laid the letter upon the grave and pressed his palm to the stone. "You are not forgotten," he whispered. As twilight descended, Aldrich remained. He would spend the night here, keeping vigil. There was peace in that decision, and perhaps a measure of redemption. But far to the north, beyond the hills and the frost-bitten moors, word was spreading. A black banner had been seen flying once more, marked by the emblem of a dragon eating its own tail. A banner Aldrich had not seen in 20 years. A banner he had once sworn to destroy. Though the knight sought only peace, fate had other plans. And the past, like a wounded beast, would soon rise again. Of course. Here's part 21 of the story. Dawn came slowly to Branton, its light a pale gray veil draped across the broken stones and slumbering earth. The cold breath of morning stirred the ivy and frost-kissed grass, and the birds, what few remained in this forgotten hamlet, sang a plaintive tune, as if mourning more than they welcomed the day. Sir Aldrich rose stiffly from where he had rested beside Elric's grave, joints protesting, muscles aching from the damp night. He had not truly slept, but rather drifted in and out of memory, haunted by visions too stubborn to be exorcised by time. He looked once more upon the stone, now partially illuminated by the rising light, and touched it with fingers ungloved. It felt colder than the earth around it, as though it carried not only Elric's remains, but the sorrow of all who had died with dreams unrealized. He rose and spoke no words this time. There were none left. The silence between old friends could often be more meaningful than any prayer. Leading his horse from the ruined village, Aldrich did not glance back. He did not need to. Branton would remain within him, preserved not in its decayed state, but in the warmth of a fireside, the laughter of children, and the kindness of Elric's smile beneath his helm. That was the Branton he carried now, and it was lighter than the sorrow he had borne. As he returned to the main road, little more than a muddy scar through thicket and thistle, a rider approached from the east. The figure was cloaked and travel-worn, and Aldrich's hand drifted to his sword instinctively, but the rider raised a palm in peace and slowed to a trot. As they neared, Aldrich recognized the face, young, marked by travel, but familiar, the squire of Lord Brannock from the high northern marches. The lad bowed his head with deference and urgency. "Sir Aldrich," he said, breath visible in the cold, "you are sought. The banner has risen again." Aldrich's heart sank. He had hoped the whispers were only that, fleeting tales stirred by idle mouths and fearful hearts. But here it was confirmed. Where? He asked, voice quiet but firm. North of Hearthlow. They took the border fort without resistance. They wear black mail and their shields bear the Ouroboros. Aldrich exhaled slowly. The dragon devouring its own tail, a symbol that had once chilled the marrow of kings and peasants alike. The Order of the Hollow Flame. Thought extinguished, broken at the siege of Wormgate. Yet evil, like a buried ember, waits patiently for breath. They're not many, the squire continued, but they move like shadows. Villages vanish, patrols don't return. The lords of the north call for a gathering. Aldrich nodded, eyes narrowed against the pale horizon. I will ride with you. The road north took them through lands once rich with promise, now choked by unease. In hamlets where the riders passed, folk eyed them from shuttered windows, and mothers clutched their children as if war could be warded off by proximity to fear. Aldrich did not wear his helm, for he knew the sight of a knight's face, lined with years and sorrow, offered more comfort than any steel visage. When they reached Hearthlow, the village lay in eerie stillness. There were signs of struggle, doors broken, livestock slaughtered, hearths still warm, but not a soul remained. Even the dogs had vanished. Aldrich dismounted and knelt beside a faint trail of prints, light, deliberate, the mark of soldiers trained not only in combat but in fear. He felt the echo of old battles rise within him. The tactics of the Hollow Flame were unchanged. Strike swiftly, sow terror, and disappear. At the edge of the woods beyond the village, they found a survivor. A girl barely 7, shivering beneath a cart, her eyes wide and hollow. She spoke little, only enough to confirm what they feared. Black-clad men had come at night, saying nothing, killing only those who resisted. The others had been taken. Taken. That word carried too many meanings, none of them kind. They rode on. With each mile, the weight of destiny grew heavier. In the northern fortress of Caervarin, the lords had gathered, gray-haired war men and young knights alike, their banners drooping in the frost wind, their voices low. They remembered Aldrich, and his arrival stirred not applause but silence, born of respect and the gravity he carried. Within the stone hall, warmed by hearths that could not thaw the fear, they convened. Lord Brannock stood, a massive man, his once red beard now streaked with white. They've returned, he said, and we are not the men we once were. Aldrich met his gaze. No, but neither are they. There was silence. Then another lord, Sir Roderick, thin and sharp-eyed, spoke. You fought them before, Aldrich. Tell us how we beat them now. Aldrich's voice came slow, deliberate. We do not match them in terror. We must become memory. We must make them remember what they fled at Wormgate, fire and steel and unity. He paused. But above all, we must fight not with hate. They feed on it. We fight with hope. A murmur passed through the hall. They had heard the word before, often from those too young to know better. But from Aldrich's lips, it carried the weight of funeral bells and sunrise. That night, he sat alone in the chapel of Caervarin, beneath a tapestry of St. Theomar, knight, martyr, peacemaker. He prayed not for victory, but for strength to protect those who could not wield a sword. For he knew this was not the end of his tale, but the beginning of a reckoning long delayed. Outside, snow began to fall, silent, relentless, beautiful, like memory, like fate. The snow fell in solemn silence across the northern lands, cloaking Caervarin in a mantle of white. It drifted down the sides of the ancient keep, settled atop the battlements, and softened the grim edges of war preparations below. Torches guttered in the wind, their flames dim against the frozen hush. Within the walls, men moved like ghosts, quiet, deliberate, their breath visible as they sharpened blades and oiled leather, muttering prayers into gloved hands. Sir Aldrich stood atop the ramparts, his cloak pulled tight, eyes scanning the gray woods beyond the frozen river. Somewhere in those silent trees, the hollow flame waited. He did not yet know when they would strike, but he felt their presence, as one feels the storm before it breaks, as one senses eyes upon the back of the neck. Old instincts, long buried, had risen again. He had spoken to each of the knights who would ride with him, young men with eager faces, their armor still unscarred. He did not fill their heads with glory. He did not promise them survival. He spoke only of duty, of remembrance, and of the line they must hold, not with swords alone, but with the courage to endure. The plan was simple, because simplicity was often the only answer against chaos. The hollow flame thrived in confusion. Aldrich would not give it to them. They would meet the enemy in the valley of Frostmere, where the terrain favored neither horse nor ambush, and the narrow pass allowed no flanking. It would be a contest of will, grit, and endurance, a war not of brilliance, but of backbone. As the knights gathered in the courtyard at dawn, their breath rising like incense, Aldrich approached his steed, the old gray named Morrow. He had ridden this horse through the wastes of Hallabreach and the fires of Wormgate. He placed a hand on its neck and whispered words too soft for others to hear, words of thanks, of sorrow, and perhaps of farewell. Then he mounted, raised his sword, still chipped from battles past, and nodded. No speeches, no war cries, just the creak of leather, the snort of horses, and the sound of hooves crunching over ice as they rode out beneath a sky painted in the pale hues of grief. Frostmere awaited them, a narrow throat of land between two hills, lined with bare trees whose limbs reached skyward like pleading hands. The stream at its base had frozen into a glassy ribbon, cracked and black-veined. Snow clung to the edges like old lace, and the wind howled low through the rocks. They waited. Hours passed. The sun arced slowly, casting long shadows that stretched like ghosts. The men grew restless, but Aldrich remained still, seated atop Morrow like a statue of old resolve. And then, at the edge of the woods, they came. Figures in black armor, their helmets featureless, their banners void of heraldry. They moved without sound, without hesitation. Dozens, perhaps more, emerging like a tide of darkness. At their center rode a figure larger than the rest, clad in armor so dark it drank the light. Upon his breastplate curled the sigil of the Ouroboros, ancient and malignant. Aldrich narrowed his eyes. He knew that helm, though decades had passed since last he saw it. Sir Cale of Ibbenreach, the flame's highest blade. Once a knight of the realm, turned traitor, turned myth. The enemy halted at the far end of the pass. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, Cale raised his sword in silent command. The hollow flame advanced. Aldrich did not shout. He lowered his visor and simply whispered to the wind, "Hold." The first clash was thunder without storm, iron meeting iron, screams swallowed by the snow. The pass narrowed the fight to chaos's antithesis. Order by necessity, every blow deliberate, every shield wall tight as thread in a tapestry. Aldrich fought not like a man seeking death, but like one guarding the gates of the living. His sword moved with grim rhythm, striking with weight and memory. Beside him, young knights fell, but others stepped forward, unflinching, their eyes lit not with fear but with resolve. For hours, they held. The hollow flame struck again and again, but each wave was blunted, broken, pushed back by the sheer will of those who refused to yield. Snow turned red. The air stank of sweat, steel, and sacrifice. Then came Cale himself. He rode into the fray, striking down knights like wheat under a reaper's blade. His sword glowed faintly, cursed by deeds long buried. He found Aldrich amid the melee, and the two clashed with the sound of time cracking open. Old man, Cale snarled, "Still pretending the world can be saved?" "No," Aldrich answered, voice quiet. "Only remembered." Their battle was not swift. It was an elegy sung in steel, each blow a stanza, each wound a verse. They fought as men who had long ago lost everything but purpose. Around them, the battle slowed, soldiers drawn back by the gravity of their duel. At last, Cale faltered, a misstep, a moment. Aldrich drove his blade through the gap in his enemy's pauldron, and Cale fell, silent and still. The black banner dropped to the snow. The hollow flame, bereft of its heart, broke. Some fled. Some surrendered. Others fell on their swords, refusing to live without the shadow they had followed. By nightfall, Frostmere was quiet. Aldrich stood among the fallen, his sword lowered, his breath shallow. He did not weep. There were no tears left. But as he looked upon the field of sacrifice, he felt not pride, nor triumph, only a weary sort of peace. In the weeks that followed, he helped bury the dead. He stayed not as a hero, but as a caretaker of memory. The valley was marked not by a monument, but by the return of silence, of birdsong, of wind through clean branches. And when at last he rode south once more, he did so not in armor, but in plain cloak, with only Morrow and the road. The knight had no need for tales. His life had been one, and it had been brutal, and it had been beautiful.